Recently, I learned that Subic Bay in the Philippines would open once again as the largest naval base in the South China Sea. My mind went back to the time I spent a few years there and all the adventures I had as a young U.S. Marine captain. The map you're looking at shows the importance of this location close to Vietnam and China. This video contains many adventures and pictures of my service from 1974 to 1976. After I arrived, the command didn't know where to put me. All the captain slots were full, so it was decided that the U.S. Naval Magazine, which was located just outside of QB Point, needed a guard officer. The Naval Magazine was 33 square miles of Bataan jungle that contained several cement bunkers filled with ordnances for the 7th Fleet in the Pacific. Under my command, I had 300 plus Marines known as Separate Guard Company. Most of those Marines called duty in the mag hell, and I had to find out why. I found out that just before I arrived, there were two Marines who lost their lives mysteriously. Now, one of them was supposedly killed by Japanese ghost soldiers who threw him out of the tower he was manning, and the other Marine was simply killed. No one knew why, but his body was found in the jungle. This was sometime in February 1974. While there were many superstitious stories about ghosts, mag monsters, vampires, and other scary things associated with that jungle that would send chills down anyone's spine. There were all sorts of dangerous snakes, including pythons, cobras, green bamboo vipers, and others. They were easy to find. Sometimes you could see them crossing the road. They were long enough to take up the entire width of the road, and you either waited for them to cross or simply drove over them. Spiders and insects were everywhere. There were very large monitor lizards that grew to enormous sizes. They roamed around freely, and when coming across one of them, you left this big guy alone. I learned that you could eat them as well, but only the legs and tail. The rest of him was poisonous. Large bats blackened the sky every morning and every evening with wingspans that spread from 5 to 6 feet in width. They were called fruit bats or flying foxes because their face resembled that of a fox. Now, these bats were not dangerous. However, they were very scary looking. One of them flew not 2 feet above me and a corpsman while we were lying on our backs on the top of a mountain. I was okay, but the corpsman was quite shaken. Our monkeys were everywhere. At times, they would gather in a group and threaten our walking patrols. They would often throw rocks or anything they could get their hands on. Once I even had to drive my duty truck up the road and rescue one of our patrols surrounded by a group of very angry monkeys. I don't know why those monkeys were angry, but I'm glad I was there to get those Marines out of harm's way. One of the biggest threats to monkeys in the jungle was what is called the monkey-eating eagle. Now, this eagle is also very large and could be seen circling the Bataan jungle, looking for its next meal. The jungle was also not a very nice place to be. There were all sorts of plants that would either stick you or cut you or simply give you a nice rash. The wait a minute vines, like those I ran into in Vietnam, could cause great harm, not only tearing your clothes but your skin. The triple thick canopy bamboo and leaves could block out the sun. Still, somehow, I grew to love it all. Now it was the custom for Marine officers to receive a welcome aboard party. Mine was held at the Officers Club located at Subic Bay. While enjoying my party, a Marine came rushing in and stated that two bodies had been discovered by a Marine patrol on the beach just under one of those towers located there. I, along with Colonel Snelling, CEO of Marine Barracks Subic Bay, and a few other Marines proceeded to go by jeep where the bodies were. We had to walk down a narrow path through the jungle next to that tower, and soon we saw the two Philippine dead bodies lying face down on the beach. Their hands had been tied behind their backs with a few balloons attached. I thought I saw one of them move. I turned him over, but he was quite dead. Soon, crabs began crawling out of his open mouth. Shortly after that incident, Colonel Snelling told me to take a few days off and visit Manila. I wanted to get to know the Philippines other than a town located just outside the base called Olongapo, where we all went on liberty. Now, this picture shows the Shit River Bridge that we needed to cross from Subic to the town. GIs would throw pesos into the water and watch young boys dive for them. Now, they didn't call Shit River for nothing. I wonder if it still smells as bad as I remember. Well, I took a bus from Subic to Manila, and that ride was an eye-opener as well. Lots of vendors ran up to the bus when it stopped. I heard them holler, "Balut, balut, balut," and I watched them carrying their baskets full of eggs. Now, balut egg is a fertilized duck egg that to this day I never will and never have eaten. The first place I went to was a 55-acre theme park located by the international airport called O Neong Filipino. I hope I said that right. I think it was first opened in 1972. Well, as I walked around the park and saw the sights, I came across a movie set. As I watched them making the movie, an attractive lady approached me and asked me lots of questions. She wanted to know who I was, how long I had been in the Philippines, and how long I was going to stay. After she left, someone asked me if I knew who she was, and I said no. Who was she? Well, that's Imelda Marcos. Oh, welcome to the Philippines. The Philippines is hot, and it takes a while to acclimatize. Well, I did this by running every day, as a Marine usually does. And there was an incentive that the command put out called the 100-mile club. That meant you had to run 100 miles within 90 days. I did it in 30, from the 11th of March till the 12th of April. Early on the morning of the 13th of April, I had breakfast with a CB officer at the officers' quarters in QB. I can't remember which officer it was, but it was either Commander Dobler or Lieutenant Jeffries. He told me that he was heading out to the jungle around Subic to inspect the road that his CBs were constructing. At mid-morning, I was informed that 3 CB officers had been shot on the road in the jungle around Subic Bay. I, along with 10 other Marines and a few Filipino constabularies, were taken to that location by helo. Lieutenant Jeffries' detachment, who were working about a half-mile away, heard the shooting. They rushed to the ambush scene and notified base headquarters. When we arrived, we found the 3 CB officers' bodies that had been retrieved by the CBs. A very bloody Jeep that they were in was driven by me to a different location on top of a nearby hill where the Seabee's construction equipment had been stored. Captain Thomas J. Mitchell, Commander Dobler, and Lieutenant Jeffries had all been killed by terrorists as they were returning from their inspection. Captain Mitchell was the most senior Seabee officer in the Pacific. The next day was Easter Sunday. We were still on the top of that mountain, guarding the Seabee equipment. I held a sunrise service after making a cross using one of their shovels. Then I placed one of the deceased officers' helmets on top of it. No sermon, just the Lord's Prayer and a short message for those deceased officers. We remained there until the Seabees came for their equipment. That morning, after the Seabees left, we proceeded to patrol the jungle, hoping to find the attackers. Our patrol lasted for several days, but although no one was caught, we learned a lot. When we returned, I established patrols around the base, which proved to be very successful in the coming months. The intruders still managed to steal much from those bunkers, however, not as much as they had in the past. We also began to capture many of them and retrieve lots of stolen ordnances. I found out that living conditions in the mag was abysmal. Marines had to sleep on very thin mattresses that were infested with bed bugs and lice. They had very little chow, which usually consisted of bologna sandwiches and an apple. No hot chow. No wonder they called it hell. The post they manned was either standing alone on a very high tower or being placed next to a bunker under an old streetlight. The jungle around them was very dark and dangerous. Marine patrols consisted of walking down well-known jungle roads and along the beach. These patrols were usually conducted during daylight hours and could easily be observed by anyone working in the jungle. All of this had to change. Then one day, the Navy captain in charge of the mag called me into his office and told me that he had just received several $1,000s from the government and had to spend all of it by a certain date. Well, he asked me for some advice, and I immediately let him know how I would do it. After telling him my ideas, he gave me all that money and told me to go for it. It didn't take me long to do just that. The first thing I did was get rid of those old insect-infested mattresses with a large bonfire. Those were replaced with brand new, very thick ones supplied by the Navy. We cleaned and disinfected the entire building where the Marines were housed while living in the mag. Paint was next, and those quarters were soon fit to live in. On May 27, 1974, I was honored to be chosen to be in charge of a mixed service detail for the Memorial Day ceremony, which was going to be held at the Manila American Cemetery. Now, Colonel Snelling knew that I had once been a drill instructor at Parris Island, and he knew that I knew how to teach drill very well. This honor detail consisted of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and one Philippine constabulary. My first task was to organize, train, and drill all of them, bringing them together as one unit. After much drill, we finally arrived in Manila. This was when I first met the American ambassador, William H. Sullivan. The ceremony went very well, and all who witnessed it were moved and impressed. A few days later, Ambassador Sullivan requested me by name to be in charge of the detail for the Philippine Independence Day celebration. This event was conducted at the American Embassy in Manila. It was a great honor to be chosen for this duty. In the city, many thousand people attended a huge parade that included every tribe that inhabited the Philippines throughout their history. There were floats, military units, reenactors, and generals riding horseback who marched in front of the reviewing stand. All who attended seemed to really enjoy this event. This parade was a celebration of independence from 300 years of Spanish rule. President Ferdinand Marcos and many other dignitaries, including the contestants of the Miss Universe contest 1974, attended the event. Now, this parade represented Philippine history and culture. Very impressive, but after the ceremony, the embassy, I returned to my hotel and watched the parade on TV. Well, that was much safer. There was also something else that happened right after the ceremony at the embassy, just before I left. A Marine Reserve captain who worked at the embassy approached me and asked if I would sponsor him for his 30-day active duty that he was required to do. I said, sure, I'd be happy to, and told him who to contact and request me as his sponsor. Even though I enjoyed my time in Manila, I was anxious to get back to the MAG. When I did get back, I asked the Navy if they would do a reconnaissance flight over the MAG and take aerial photos of the surrounding jungle. Well, those photos were blown up and put together like a puzzle. Then they were hung on a wall right behind my desk in my office in the MAG. On this map, I named jungle trails as the California Freeway, Pennsylvania Turnpike, Route 66, and others. This made it easy to locate patrol routes and intelligence. Well, the intruders we faced in the MAG were made up of local thieves, Moros from places like Mindanao, and a relatively new group called the New People's Army. There were news reports that those NPAs, or New People's Army, were responsible for the assassination of the 3 CB officers earlier that year. Well, this is us returning from one of our long-range patrols. That's me carrying what I call my snake stick. Now, on this patrol, we had to cross a large log that had fallen across the jungle stream. I hit the top of this log before we climbed over it, only to find a large cobra resting on top. When it rose up, I hit the snake with my stick, and it quickly left, which allowed us to cross. Well, that's why I called it my snake stick. With better living conditions, all the Marines began to look forward to their time in the MAG. They no longer called the MAG hell. Input from the Marines who conducted their duties in the MAG caused me to make some changes, both with patrols and those static guard locations. Their duties became more fluid, and missions changed frequently. This made it a lot more interesting for everyone, and it made it a lot harder for the intruders to move. They could no longer guess where the Marines would show up next, and it paid off. I used to climb to the top of each guard tower and spend some time with the Marines on duty. Those towers allowed us to observe the area very well. One night, I was in the same tower next to the ocean where those Filipinos washed ashore shortly after I arrived. We watched a wild boar walking along the shore when suddenly a shark jumped out of the water, grabbed the boar, flopped around, and returned to the ocean with that screaming pig in his mouth. Well, after that, I made an amendment to the patrol order for the Marines to watch out for sharks and wild boar. I know some of them laughed about the reference to watching out for sharks, but that was no joke. Well, that reserve Marine captain I met at the embassy finally reported for duty. I immediately put him to work. First, I had to get him fit. So we ran and began an intense physical fitness program. His experience in the Corps was mostly in administration, so this was all quite new to him. I'm sorry, but I can't remember his name. Because of the dangers involved, he had to be able to act and react quickly. After a week of physical fitness, weapons training, and learning about the jungle, he was ready for his first patrol. Now, he did have a hard time on that patrol, climbing mountains, cutting his way through the thick jungle, and sleeping in the open while listening to all the jungle night creatures. And keeping up with the rest of us proved to be a challenge. Well, despite all these hardships, he managed to come through his 30-day active duty very well. I was very proud of him. During the time he spent with me, he told me that someone found him in Manila at the embassy and asked for his help. This person had written a movie script but needed lots of advice. He wanted to know what a former U.S. Marine captain would do if he were hired as a mercenary and go into the jungle to rescue someone who had been kidnapped by a terrorist group. I laughed and told him what I might say about that, then gave him a few ideas. He thought they were great ideas and asked me if I would meet with that writer. I said I would, but he'd have to come to QB Point if he wanted to meet with me, because I just couldn't get away anytime I wanted. When his time was up, the last thing he told me before he left was that he would get up with that scriptwriter and tell him about me. I just smiled, forgot about it, and returned to my duties in the mag. Intruders and Marines just passed through that jungle, but there were those called Negritos who lived there. These people were small and very rarely seen. I did come across some of them from time to time deep in the jungle. I even used to carry a few bags of candy to give to their children, and I made friends with whoever I met. This friendship proved to be a very good thing. Often, intruders would shoot them and sometimes kill them. That's why they were always suspicious of strangers. You always had to be aware of the unexpected in the mag. Once when I was checking posts, I saw two Marines carrying a heavy footlocker. I asked them what they had, and they told me it was a snake. I said, "Open it." When they did, all of a sudden, a huge python jumped out at me. I caught it behind the neck and it wrapped around me. I hollered, "Get that damn snake off of me." Very quickly, they grabbed it and put it back in the footlocker. Now, we had two choices: put it back in the jungle where they found it, or take it to the fire station, which was manned by Filipino firemen. I knew that those Filipinos liked to eat snake. A short time later, one of them came up to my office and gave me that snake skin. A Munmungo. That's what they call the Filipino Bigfoot. We called it the mag monster. There were lots of stories about the mag monster from Marine patrols, especially after I increased them and changed their routes. Now, this happened one very scary night. We got a call from one of our Marines posted at a bunker next to the chain link fence that surrounded the mag. His voice was shaken as he reported suspicious noises and movements close to his post on the jungle side of that chain link fence. He called for backup, and the sergeant of the guard arrived first. This sergeant called me on his radio while I was on the way and said that there was something weird going on. Then he said that it sounded kind of like the mag monster. While he was still talking, he hollered, and then I heard loud noises in the background. Then his radio went dead. When I arrived, I saw both the sergeant and the Marine guard crouching next to that bunker with their weapons pointing down the hill. In the distance, I saw part of that chain link fence with a large hole in it and trees torn up by their roots. We carefully moved toward the damage, not knowing what could have caused it. As I got close to the damage, I looked over the cliff behind the hole in the fence, and I saw a strange sight. I asked the sergeant where he had parked his truck. He told me it was on the top of the hill by the bunker, and I said, no, it isn't. Then I showed him where his truck was. Found out that he had forgotten to put his handbrake on, and it quietly rolled down the hill and through the fence, then ended up at the bottom of the cliff. Well, so much for this mad monster sighting. Marine officers serving at Subic Bay would be assigned as the officer of the day for the base. Our duties included driving around the base and checking the area. On the 4th of June, 1974, it was my turn. That evening, as I drove around the base next to the airstrip, a call came in over my radio saying that an F-4 Phantom had to make an emergency landing. Now, I notified the base of my position and told headquarters that I was close to the air station and would give assistance. I proceeded to place myself next to the end of the runway. Emergency vehicles were in place, and the runway was sprayed with white foam. In a very short time, I witnessed the jet coming in when two pilots ejected. The jet hit the runway and ran into some buildings close to me and exploded. Because of those first responders and the fact that there was no one I could see or help, I simply left the area and put in my report. Now, there was a large picture window in my office in the MAG. It allowed me to watch Marines returning from their patrols down the road. On one occasion, when I saw a four-man patrol walking down this road, one of them fell and did not get up. Well, I thought it might be heat-related, so I got in my duty truck and went to him as fast as I could. When I got to him, I asked the others who were trying to help how he was. They all looked very concerned because he had turned white and hadn't moved. Then one of the Marines told me that he thought a snake had bitten him. Then he showed me a tin can with a baby snake inside that the fallen Marine had been playing with just before he fell. Oh, they put him in the back of my truck and we all went directly to the hospital located at Cutie Point. When we arrived, I was told that he was dead. Later, I found out that that little baby snake he had collected was a newborn bamboo viper, which is very poisonous, especially the baby ones. We used to call them two-step snakes in Vietnam, and in the Philippines, seven-step snakes, which only meant that you're bitten by one, you take 7 steps and you're dead. Nothing to play with. One of my duties consisted of being sent to the barrios of Luzon to meet with the Capitan del Barrio and his family. Here are a couple of pictures of me and a gunnery sergeant, I'm sorry I forgot his name, who went with me to visit the Capitan and his family. We would simply talk with them and usually share a meal. Just a goodwill visit. Well, their homes were kind of like this. They were built high, which kept them cooler, with large windows on all sides of the second floor that allowed a really good airflow. There were a lot of surprises that happened to me during that time. One of them was when a very good friend of mine, Staff Sergeant Percy Price, visited me. You see, Percy was one of the head coaches of the boxing team at Camp Lejeune. I was the executive officer of Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune before being sent to the Philippines. As the XO, I appointed Percy to help reestablish the boxing team. We worked hard to start that team because it had been dismantled during the Vietnam War, and there was much opposition of it being restarted by senior officers. They argued that Marine Corps sports teams had no place in a combat Marine Corps. I argued that this fighting spirit was essential, and a boxing team could only benefit the morale of the troops. Fortunately, Headquarters Marine Corps agreed with me, and the boxing team was reestablished. Now, Percy Price was also the Marine who beat Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali during the 1960 Olympic trials in Rome. He also served 2 tours in Vietnam, and to me, a real hero. I was proud to call him my friend. I always used to say that one of Percy's hands made 2 of mine. Yesterday, as I searched for information on Google, I ran across an article about him that proved what I used to say. This is a copy of that information. Before yesterday, I never knew that he had to have special boxing gloves made because his hands were so big. There were many great boxers, which included the Marine I used to call Toothless, or Leon Spinks, who joined the boxing team in 1973. During Percy's visit with me in the Philippines, I introduced him to his wife, who I had met at the QBO Club. I was very proud to be the best man at Percy's wedding. Then in December 1974, I got my chance to go through JEST, or Jungle Environmental Survival Training. This was invaluable training that I really enjoyed. I learned about drinking fresh water using a water vine. I caught, cooked, and ate bamboo bats, made shelter, learned how to use plants for medicine, and made fire using bamboo, as well as many other life-saving skills. While going through JEST, my instructor, I think his name was Ignatius, became a good friend of mine. I hired him as a scout to lead Marine patrols through areas of the jungle we hadn't been before. Now, this picture shows a Moro sword he gave me as a gift. I'll never forget one patrol he took us on. There was a very tiny bird in a bush we came across that flew up quickly like small birds do. Ignatius took out a slingshot from his belt and hit that bird in mid-flight. Then he simply walked over to it, put it in his pouch, and we continued down the trail. Now that was an impossible shot, but he made it look easy. He also gave me my bolo, which is that knife, and Negrito arrows shown here. Later, I allowed him to construct his house in the mag for protection. After he moved his family in, I used to visit them from time to time. Then one day, I learned that while he was on a hunting trip in the jungle, someone killed him. He was a great loss to us all. I never did get the ones that did that, but it wasn't hard to have a good idea of who they were. Intruders. Here is an article I found on the internet. It talks about Negritos being hired as trackers and guides. And I'm very proud of my JEST certificate. Temperatures in the Philippines are generally hot. The jungle is hot and steamy, but sometimes, especially at night, it does turn cold. This was the case Christmas Eve, 1974. The Marines on duty in the MAG only had a thin field jacket for warmth. It offered some protection, but not much. When it rained, they were very wet, cold, and miserable. Well, that night I decided to make their lives a little better. Just before midnight, I woke up the U.S. naval officer who oversaw the enlisted chow hall at Subic. I had him open the mess hall and supply me with containers of hot coffee, some good sandwiches, and cake. Then I proceeded to each post in the MAG, gave those poor duty Marines a little treat, and wished them all a Merry Christmas. There was enough to feed all the Marines on duty in the MAG that night. Then the thought hit me. We should have our own mess hall in the MAG that would supply a hot meal 24/7. There was an unused building located in the MAG that I did use. I even had enough money to hire Filipino kitchen staff for an extended period. That's when I learned that for all the appliances like stoves, ovens, and freezers to work, we needed a large generator. After researching, I found that there was a generator not being used located at Clark Air Force Base. Now, going through channels to requisition a generator from the Air Force to be used for Marines at Subic would have been a very long, drawn-out procedure. So without the proper authority or paperwork, I simply took a truck to Clark, found the generator in the warehouse, and had it loaded on my truck. Well, there were two of them, so I took them both, one as a backup. No one ever said anything, and for all I know, they may still be there. Well, it wasn't long before the MAG mess hall was up and running. It became very popular. Steak and lobster tail was served every Friday, and even the Admiral ate there from time to time. But to my knowledge, it was the only Marine Corps mess hall that had monkey meat on the menu. Because Marines who served in the MAG could now get a hot meal 24/7, rest and sleep in clean quarters, and make good progress in chasing the bad guys in the jungle, there were those who requested duty in the MAG. Well, this was a complete reversal of what it was like when they used to call it hell. Juan J. Rodriguez remembers this time very well. Here's a picture of him when he was a U.S. Marine stationed with Separate Guard Company in 1975. I found him on the internet last month. The video that he and his family made while visiting QB Point this year was fantastic. When he found out that I was making this video, he told me that I could use his in any way I wanted. The road we used to run is presented in his video very accurately.
This is my road. Luna? Yep, this is my road. This is the one once we got down here, we turn around and go back up the road. This is our road going up and down. Memory lane. Yep. Oh God.
Hindi siya nag-boarding nung araw, ante? Oo. Station daw siya dito. Alam niya. Natatandaan niya pa pala.
from here we could see the airport. Could be point right here. Yep, here we go. Right about here was the base, and this was CPO club. So right here, yep, right here. This is where I was. We were stationed right here.
Now these pictures show the difference between what separate guard barracks was like in 1974 and what it is like today. 51 years is a long time. I would like to thank Mr. Rodriguez for his contribution to the making of this video. I believe Mr. Rodriguez would remember the patrols we conducted 24/7. This is just one of those overnight patrols that was very successful. The bolo, or knife I'm holding in this picture, was taken from that intruder. He tried to use it to cut the head off the Marine, as shown here, bringing him back. Well, that intruder was turned over to the Philippine Constabulary, who executed him a few days later. He had been wanted for crimes, including conducting lots of murders. There was a very little time between being found guilty, sentencing, and execution in the Philippines in 1975. Here is another picture of the end of another successful long-range patrol after the bad guys. Every Marine was handpicked, experienced, highly trained, and outstanding in the performance of their duties. I will always be very proud to have had the privilege of serving with each and every one of them. One Sunday morning, I had just returned from one of those long-range patrols. I entered into my office in the mag and my phone was ringing off the hook. It was the maitre d' at the O Club in Subic, telling me that I had 3 visitors waiting for me. A little background about that club. Ever since I arrived at Subic, I made friends with all the Filipino staff that worked in the club. I even used to buy their children presents for their birthdays and Christmas. This was why my guests were treated so well. So I took my Jeep straight to the club. I was still wearing my helmet, no rack insignia, and carrying my rifle as I entered. I walked in and the maitre d' hollered, "Captain Darrow!" He rushed over to me, took me by the arm, and ushered me over to my guests. I even had some camo left on my face and hadn't showered for several days, so I was a sight. Now, being Sunday, all the other officers in the club, mostly Navy, were in their dress whites. Most of them looked at me with great disgust. Still, nothing was said as I took my place at my table with my guests. I sat my rifle and helmet on the floor next to my chair. Then I met Michael J. Parsons, Bob Mitchell, and Takashi Ohashi. I found out that they were there because they heard about me from that captain who had served with me in the mag earlier that year. Now, these were famous movie folks. I came to find out that Ohashi was famous for the movie Tora Tora Tora. Bob Mitchell was the art director and Oscar nominee for The Yellow Submarine, and Michael Parsons wrote the movie High Velocity as well as being in the movie business for several years. Well, that movie High Velocity was why they were there. They began asking me some questions about what I would do in certain situations. Then I said, "Gentlemen, before we begin, may I order you all my famous breakfast?" I had been waiting for this for over a week and was kind of hungry. Then I simply told the maitre d' to bring my favorite all around. I guess he knew what I wanted because they immediately started serving the chicken cordon bleu with champagne to my table. Then Michael Parsons asked, "If I hired you as a mercenary to go after terrorists in the jungle, how many men would you need?" I smiled and said, "Well, one plus a scout." They were all surprised and started laughing, but I was dead serious. Then during that great breakfast, more questions followed. After breakfast, I was offered that movie script and asked if I would look it over and add anything I wanted. I agreed and we parted. I never thought that I would ever see them again, but writing some action scenes, including all the weapons and explosives and some dialogue, sounded like fun. Later that day, I returned to my quarters, but came down with a malaria attack. Even though I had high fever, I wrote those recommendations. The following day, I mailed that information to Mike Parsons in Manila with the idea that I hoped he could use some of it. I got over that malaria attack in a couple days and returned to my duties in the mag. Well, they used to say, if you want to find Captain Darrow, look for him in the jungle. Well, that was mostly true, although I did come out from time to time. I found out that flying lessons were being offered at QB Point. Not only was this something that I always wanted to do, but now I could do it. At this same time, there was another officer that was assigned to me in the MAG who was a Marine pilot. Well, he flew Phantoms and was there serving his collateral duty. This type of duty meant that pilots had to serve as a ground officer for a few months. So he chose serving his time with me in the MAG. It was kind of like that with that reserve captain from the embassy. Well, I was very fortunate because he walked me through all the paperwork needed for my flight school, which I passed with flying colors, pun intended. I really loved flying, and it wasn't very long when I made my first solo flight there at QB Point. From then on, all I had to do was sign out a Cessna, and I could fly to Manila or wherever I wanted, which proved to be very handy and saved lots of time. Now, during this time, I got a call from Mr. Bob Mitchell, one of those movie folks. He asked me when I could come to Manila because all those recommendations I had submitted to Michael Parsons had been approved by Remy Kramer, who had been chosen as the movie director for that movie. Remy was still in the States at the time. Now, Bob told me that they also wanted to hire me as their military technical advisor. Well, I never heard of what a military technical advisor did, but that sounded like some more fun. I found out that I could work on the movie on my spare time, so I agreed. My very first flight to Manila was to meet with Mr. Bob Mitchell, who picked me up at the airport. He was a very likable man who was a little short, stout, and had the best mutton chop sideburns I had ever seen. He also had a love of Irish music like me. I brought my guitar along and we used to sing Irish folk songs together. He soon became one of my best friends of all time. A lieutenant commander who lived right above me in the officers' quarters at QB Point introduced me to a friend of his. His friend told me that the next time I went to Manila, check out the movie they're making close to the park. So I changed into my civvies and went to Manila. I was kind of curious. That's when I first met Alejandro Ray. Well, everyone on the set were Filipino except for him. Then someone who had been working on that movie asked me if I'd be interested in doing a TV commercial. Well, I said, sure, when? A short time later, I was the Philippine Marlboro Man. Here are a few pictures of me doing that commercial for the TV. It only took me a day, but it was a fun thing to do. Well, back to work. But this time, I was assigned as the S2 or intelligence officer for Subic Bay. I had to go to Marine Barracks Subic Bay, so they finally got me out of the jungle. I still managed to conduct some patrols around the base though. This time, I went by myself, just to take a few security pictures. You see, there were a lot of giant holes in that chain link fence that surrounded the base. Lots of people simply wandered in and wandered out, and the admiral had to know. Once I ran across this guy. Yep, it was a wild water buffalo. Now these pictures were taken over 11 years before the Crocodile Dundee movie hit the screen. Well, May 26, 1975, another Memorial Day in Manila, and I was there. Right after that ceremony, I was taken to a small studio in Manila to see some rushes of high velocity. I learned that the term rushes referred to short clips watched after filming. That's when I first met some of the actors. Later, Ben Gazzara and Paul Wainfield visited me at my quarters in Subic. They had lots of questions about some action scenes, and I got to know them well. When I first wrote my recommendations for that movie, I added a character who I based on one of my old Marine buddies I served with in Vietnam named P.T. Scott. He was a black Marine and one of my best friends who served many months with me in Vietnam. Paul Wainfield portrayed him in High Velocity. Many of the scenes in High Velocity were events that P.T. Scott and I actually experienced. Even our relationship is portrayed well between Ben and Paul in the movie. Well, I spent all my spare time working in Manila on that movie and made lots of friends, including Victoria Racimo, Keenan Wynn, Michael Parsons, and many others. Of course, I had already met Alana Ray, who was delighted to meet with me once again. Remy Kramer, the director of that movie, also became a very close friend and still is. Since 1975, we have worked on many projects together. I got to know Remy as a brother and talk with him often. High Velocity was still being made when in May 1975, Vietnam fell and thousands of boat people came to the Philippines. I was assigned as the Operations, Security, Civil Affairs Officer at the first refugee camp located on an island called Camp Grandy. I made another video called Vietnamese Refugees 1975. That told the story of Grandy Island. I put a link in the description. But working in that refugee camp didn't give me much spare time, but I was still able to work on High Velocity every now and then. I even was able to do some stunt double work. On the 5th of July, 1975, the last refugee left Grandy Island. For me, this was the end of the war. Now, since the war was over for me, I resigned my commission, which was mostly unbelieved by my fellow Marine buddies. It took me 3 letters of resignation to convince the Corps that I was serious. They even sent 2 representatives from Headquarters Marine Corps to try to convince me to stay in. Now, after they told me that I would make major and be stationed in D.C., I pleaded with them to send me anywhere other than D.C. My request was denied, and I was assured that this was where my next duty station would be. This is what prompted my third letter of resignation, which was finally accepted. Now, although the movie Jeremiah Johnson had been released in 1972, I hadn't seen the movie until July 1975, right after my time at Grandy. This film struck a chord deep in me, and I decided that someday I would head to Montana and do exactly what Jeremiah Johnson did. I wanted to move to the mountains, get as far away from civilization as possible, build a log cabin, and raise horses. Now, my father had been born in the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, and although I'd never been there, I always wanted to live there. Now, I talked a lot about that movie when I got back to Subic. My duty clerk listened to me talk about the movie and my plans to live in the wilderness, so he and others chipped in and bought me a pewter beer mug with a Marine Corps emblem engraved on one side, and on the other side it was engraved with to Captain Wild Billy Darrow from his troops. Sir, can you skin grizz? Now, this is one of my most prized possessions to this day. Then one day I received a package which contained a movie script titled Apocalypse Now. I learned that I had been chosen as the military technical advisor for that movie, and soon Francis Ford Coppola would meet me in Manila. Well, I carefully read the script, and I couldn't believe what I read. The script was full of lies about the Vietnamese people and the war. There were parts of it that made all American servicemen look like drug-addicted monsters who really enjoyed killing, especially children. I wondered if this was the same Francis Ford Coppola that had anything to do with the movie Patton. After reading this script, I decided to send it to the Pentagon with a letter of recommendation that no active duty service members be allowed to take part or work on the movie in any way, and why. Within a few days, orders from the Pentagon, all branches of the service, stated that no U.S. military was allowed to participate in the production of this movie at any time. A short time later, I met with Francis Ford Coppola in Manila at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. I was in my uniform when I entered his room. I first shook his hand and talked about the movie Patton. I told him that this movie was one of the best, most patriotic movies I had ever seen. He smiled and told me that Patton was really supposed to be an anti-war movie, but because they used General Omar Bradley, much of that movie was changed. You see, General Bradley wanted that movie to be more historically correct. Then I asked him where he got the idea for Apocalypse Now, and he said that this movie was based on a book written about a missionary who went crazy in Africa and joined a native tribe. He just replaced the location to Vietnam. I told him that there was little or nothing in the script that resembled Vietnam, its people, and especially all those Americans who fought in that war. He just laughed and restated that this was going to be his anti-war movie he always wanted to do. Then I told him he might, but without any active duty personnel or equipment. And I let him know what I had done with his script. I'd sent it to the Pentagon and what their reaction was. His face turned bright red, and I could see how upset he was. He stood, pointed his finger at me, and told me that I would never work in Hollywood. I smiled at him and said, "Why do you think I would ever want to work in Hollywood? I'm a United States Captain of Marines." Then I turned and walked out of his room. I had already been invited to have dinner with Mr. Pritzker, Now, he is the owner, well, he was the owner of all the Hyatt Regency hotels in the world. I met and got to know him earlier during one of my ceremonies in Manila. Mr. Pritzker was a very large man who enjoyed his dinners in his room at the Hyatt. So that's where I went after the meeting with Coppola. When I arrived at Mr. Pritzker's room, he greeted me warmly and immediately asked me what was wrong. I guess he saw the disgusted look on my face. I told him what had just occurred and apologized for my demeanor. Without asking any questions, he picked up the phone and gave orders to his staff to kick Francis Ford Coppola and whoever came with him out of the hotel immediately. Now, Mr. Pritzker was a very large man, both in stature and in patriotism. At the end of September, I was again invited to have dinner with Mr. Pritzker in his room. Muhammad Ali was giving a press conference at the entrance to the hotel. I did not see Ali. However, Mr. Pritzker's son was there, went down to see Ali, and pretended to spar with him for the press. Just a little side note. Before that meeting in Manila, while still at Subic, I had the honor of sparring with a Marine gunnery sergeant in the gym. While I was showing some boxing techniques to a friend of mine, when the gunny asked me if I would be willing to go a few rounds with him. Now, this gunny was short, a little stout, and I told him that I didn't want to hurt him. But he just laughed and said, "No, Skipper, come on." So I obliged. After the second round, I knew I was outclassed, and he beat me up pretty good. Hitting him was like hitting a cannonball. Well, he was tough. Then I found out that he was Joe Frazier's sparring partner and getting Joe ready for the big fight. Because of this experience, I will never forget the thrilla in Manila. While I was still working as the S2 officer in Subic, the 200th Marine Corps birthday was approaching fast. I was chosen to help prepare for this momentous event. Colonel Burhans, the CEO of Marine Barracks, Colonel Bottolato, the Provost Marshal, and I were discussing the upcoming ball in Colonel Burhan's office. It was decided that something should be given as a token of this monumental occasion. Then Colonel Bottolato said that he knew of a Korean company that would take old brass, melt it down, and make beautiful military wall hangings. Colonel Burhans turned and asked me what I thought. I said, I thought it was a great idea. So he ordered me to get it done. So I collected all the brass shells after the Navy fired their guns right outside my office window every day and had them sent to that Korean company who turned them into brass plates like the one shown here. Now that brass plate I bought for my father and mother who served in World War II. I'll never forget that ball. We held the ball at the Officers Club in Cuba. Now, I was dressed in my 8th and I uniform with white trousers and dress blue jacket. In 1976, I was reassigned to be the executive officer for Bravo Company, which used to be Separate Guard Company. It was back to the jungle for me. That's where I was happiest. Another Marine I fondly remember is First Sergeant Don Griffith. Now, this is a picture of him and his wife taken in 2006. One day he visited me in my office in the MAG with a request that both surprised and fascinated me. He told me that for a long time he had been researching an old book that talked about the Battle of Bataan. He said that one of the last battles fought was in a place they called the Toll River Valley. This area had long been forgotten. First Sergeant Griffith thought he knew where the valley was and wanted permission to go and find it. From January 2nd to April 9th, 1942, American and Filipino forces bravely fought for 3 months against Imperial Japan. Those who held out earned the name of the Battling Bastards of Bataan. The Japanese finally prevailed, which led to the surrender of the Americans and Filipinos and the Bataan Death March. 60 to 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war were forced marched 66 miles in 3 days during the brutal heat without food or water. Japanese soldiers wouldn't allow anyone to linger in the shade, of which there was very little, and killed men who tried to dive into buffalo wallows to drink the filthy water. Many Filipino civilians attempted to give the captors aid as they marched through their villages, only to be killed for their efforts. I had first-hand knowledge of the Bataan Death March because my father, Navy Lieutenant Henry O. Darrow, was one of those battling bastards of Bataan. He told me of the heroic Filipinos who saved his life. I have always respected, loved, and admired the Filipino people because of what they did for my dad in 1942. Sergeant Griffith went on to tell me that he needed to get permission to go through the mag and pass through the southern gate. It was the quickest way to get to the village located in Bataan, close to his destination. I told him that the only way I would grant his request was that I would go along with him. Well, Sergeant Griffith agreed, and we began to make our plans for the expedition. The chief of police close to the area we were going to helped us a lot. He knew of one Filipino veteran of that battle still alive, who he recommended for us to use as our guide. Now, that Filipino was also wanted with a price on his head. He was granted amnesty for the time he agreed to guide us. We also needed to gather an armed Filipino force to be security for this mission. I would rather have had a few well-armed Marines, but we were far off the base, and that was impossible. Well-armed Marines off base were forbidden. Here's a picture of our security force. The boy on the bottom right is Don's son, Richard Griffith, and the one on the bottom left is our hut guide. Our guide called the valley we were looking for Many Bones. We traveled through a very rough jungle towards the Tool River. It took a couple of days, and I had my 2-man mountain climbing sleeping tent for comfort. Here's a picture of that with our guide close to the Many Bones Valley. This valley had a reputation of being haunted with legions of ghosts, which kept intruders, hucks, and other bandits away. Oh, they would pass through the area, but never stay. This area was truly haunted. Our security force was very afraid and never slept. Soon we started exploring the area and found lots of artifacts left after the battle and bones that were scattered everywhere. We collected several of them. Most of what we found were simply scattered on top of the ground. I searched the surrounding jungle by following an overgrown path and found parts of vehicles which were unusual to still be there after all these years. Filipinos are very frugal people and never leave anything like metal lying around that they could use. I thought that maybe fear of the ghosts kept them away, and those parts were simply left to rust. On the second day of our exploration, it was very hot. I couldn't help but think of how it must have been during the death march. Sergeant Griffith and I decided to enjoy the cool water of the Tool River. Our guide, looking very sad, told us that this river once turned red with blood. Finally, we made our way out of Many Bones and came across the Subic monument that was placed there that marked the start of the Bataan Death March in 1942. I will never forget this experience. Towards the end of 1976, I learned that log cabins were for rent in Baguio in northern Luzon. Now, those log cabins were next to the military golf course, so I rented one and took some time off to stay in Baguio. Baguio was also known for being a lot cooler and very nice to visit. When I arrived, I was surprised to find a real log cabin with a stone fireplace. Now, Baguio was also famous for wood carvers who lived in a wood carving village along the Asian Road. Here's a picture of one of those wood carver huts. Now, these are a few hand-carved statues I brought back and still display in my home. I also purchased a hand-carved wooden tribal chess set. Each piece simply hung by a hemp string from an old wood carver's house. I think I paid around $1 or so American for the whole set. Later, I found a picture of this same chess set in a book called Chessmen of the World. The day I left Baguio, I had lunch at the U.S. Military Golf Club. I sat at an outside table where I could watch the road that came down the hill and approach the club. I was just there to watch for my limousine to take me back to Subic. Then I saw a caravan of military vehicles and official vehicles come down the hill toward the club. I knew that someone important was on the way, but I had no idea who that was. When they arrived, a large group entered the club and came directly toward my table. I turned and was surprised to see President Ferdinand Marcos approaching fast. Well, I grabbed my coffee and started to get up when he touched my shoulder and sat me back down. Then he asked if he could join me. I was in complete shock, but simply said, "Yes, sir." He then ordered his lunch and began to ask me lots of questions about who I was, why I was there, how long I had been in the Philippines, and others. He then said something I thought was strange. He asked me if it was all right with me if he could use my club to golf that afternoon. I think he asked me in kind of a sarcastic way, as though he needed my permission. My answer kind of set him back, as well as all those others that were sitting on our table, like the Philippine Air Force general in his dress whites who sat right across from me. I smiled and said, "Yes, sir, please be my guest." That general's face turned red as the president rose and left our table. Just think, one of the first Filipino people I met was Imelda Marcos, and one of the last, when I was about to leave, was the president himself. A few months later, I returned to the States. Now, this is my story of my time spent in the Philippines when Subic Bay was still a naval base before it was closed. And now it is a naval base once again. I really enjoyed the time I served in the Philippines. Now it's time for another Marine to make more memories.